Good morning. This is my second time through the Black Panther, and both times I've been filled with just a little bit of trepidation because comic books, I think, despite the success of Marvel movies, despite all of the things that people have done to show that they are an academic um, or worthy of academic discussion, still have a rap of being completely and totally for kids, which does put them in the realm of adolescent literature. But because the books frequently contain as many pictures as words, some people still have a problem with having them looked at in an English class academically. I want to run through this first part of the slideshow dealing with superhero history, especially superhero history as it relates to African American or African characters, and then talk about why perhaps we should care a little bit and make some connections to some of the other books that we have read this semester. I think that I would have typed these three things whether I saw them in the source material Inks, a journal of comic studies from the Ohio State University. Um, I did not know there was a journal of comic studies until a year or two ago. And my life might have been a lot different had I known that that existed, or had I been able to find something like that in the 1990s when I was in grad school. But I think it's fair to say that there have not been an inordinate amount of African American superheroes or black superheroes in general. Most people believe that Black Panther was the first widely is widely known as the first black superhero. That's not true, but I think the perception that he's the first black superhero probably is. And the Falcon is called the first African American superhero because T'Challa is African, not American. It's important, I think, to remember, though, that comic books spring from two other sources. One of them is the pulp magazines that gave us characters like Doc Savage and the Shadow, and the other is the comic strips that appeared in the newspaper. And part of the idea with the comic strips in the newspaper is they too had their own version of superherodom. You can talk about the Phantom, who's still going on today, and you can talk about this character, Lothar. And Lothar began in 1934. He was super strong. Like the Black Panther, he was the king of an African nation. And as the slide says, he is still going on. I believe he is appearing in the Phantom comic strips that I just mentioned. The first comic book African or African American character was Lion Man, and it was published in 1947. It appeared in only one issue, and it was written by black writers and artists, and it featured black characters throughout. And so I think it's important to understand that efforts were made, you know, for a long time to create some African characters or African American characters, um, but that there was some systemic racism that prevented that from happening. I also think I need to point out that in the 1960s, a few months before the Black Panther appeared, Dell, which was another comic book publisher who has characters that have transferred into or have been recycled several times by mainstream books, um, had a character named Lobo who was an African American. It was set in the post Civil War era, and he was basically a character who was you know accused of a crime he did not commit and spend much of the time trying to clear his name. Dell would have been fairly widespread in the 1960s because in the 1960s there were not tons of comic book shops, and a lot of comic books were distributed in grocery stores or in drugstores, and they were just put in spinner racks. And Dell comics were widely available, at least in the rural areas where I grew up. I don't remember seeing a Lobo, but I know that Dell had the Lone Ranger. Dell had Tarzan. Uh, there were other companies like Gold Key that weren't Marvel and DC that were widely distributed on those wire racks. A couple of other things. Ever so often, I've been asked about whether the Black Panther was named after the Black Panthers Party. According to this article I found, the Black Panther would have hit those spinner racks that I talked about earlier, that I bought tons of comic books from, probably 3 or 4 months, um, maybe even up to 6 months before the Black Panther Party was officially formed. So I think it's just the idea of Stan Lee and Jack Kirby kind of pulling names out of a hat. I mean, let's face it, they weren't that creative. Spider-Man had was bitten by a radioactive spider. The Hulk is a big hulking guy, and you even had a guy covered in rocks who was called the Thing. Their naming conventions were not that original. There is a weird connection, however. Ta-Nehisi Coates, the man who wrote um, the 4 issues we're reading and has had a fairly long run on the Black Panther. His father served as chairperson of the Maryland Black Panther Party. So even though the character was not named for the party, and it's doubtful that the party was named for the character, uh, Coates does have a connection. I also do need to talk about the idea of Ta-Nehisi Coates as a public intellectual. I haven't done a lot of stuff with the authors uh, prior to this. I did mention some of the things about Ishmael Babe in his memoir, but I haven't talked about the authors a lot. And I think for Coates, it's important that we do talk about him as an author. And I think one of the things that we should talk about is the fact that he is a writer in residence at NYU, that he won a National Book Award, that he is the recipient of the MacArthur Fellowship. I believe it's called the MacArthur Genius Grant, and he's writing. He wrote the Black Panther. He's currently writing Captain America. He has written fiction called The Water Dancer. He has written, serious intellectual books, The Beautiful Struggle, We Were 8 Years in Power, and Between the World and Me. By the way, please, please, please remember when I copied and pasted, I lost the text here. Remember to italicize the titles of your novels or underline if you're doing a handwriting. The point I'm trying to make here, though, is that this is a book written by an intellectual. This is a book who studies culture seriously. This is a book written by somebody who is, widely respected for his ability to write about serious issues. And having him in the comic book, I think, is important. The other thing I want to talk about before we get to the Black Panther proper is just the idea of what is a superhero. And I probably should have a subtitle under here: Why should we care? The superhero, according to Rosenberg and Coogan, is a figure that touches centrally on the likely future of humans. And it allows us to explore these futures. It aids in our understanding of the recent past, contemporary political and social situations, um, our contemporary and political social situation, singular, and future. And I think it's important to understand that having these weird people running around in spandex can make us think about serious things and take a step back because we're looking at people running around in spandex. It doesn't mean that they're not dealing with complex issues. It doesn't mean we shouldn't be thinking about the complex issues they're talking about. It means that we can contemplate those complex issues at a distance, all right, instead of having everything right in our face. And so I think the superhero is an important element of that. If you read the whole essay that they have at the beginning of the book, it talks about the fact that superheroes are basically doing in the, you know 2000s what westerns were doing in the 40s, 50s, and early 60s. Coogan comes up and says there is a definition for a superhero: a heroic character with a universal, selfless, pro social mission. In other words, a guy who is doing good without the expectation of getting anything back from it. And so, as we're dealing with the idea of the superhero, he does great deeds, that's heroic. He does it with a universal idea, which means we can trace it back to myth and Hercules and Gilgamesh and the Navajo wonder twin Nagasani. He does it without his idea of gain. And then there's this definition of superpowers. They can be abilities, they can be technology, they can be physical or mental skills, they can include magical skills. There's some extra superpower. And Coogan goes on. There's an identity that has a code name, there's an iconic costume, and even like the Hulk or the Thing, we think about the purple pants and the torn shirt on the Hulk, or in the Thing, we think about that rock physique and the kind of boxing trunks that he frequently wears without a shirt or anything else like that. Um, those of you who may have watched Netflix's Luke Cage, there was a scene where he's basically wearing the comic book shirt and pants and the chain belt uh, because it was an iconic costume from the 1970s. There's dual identities. Peter Parker tries to hide his identity, or Spider-Man tries to hide his identity as Peter Parker. And even in the movie, the New Yorkers kind of, made it possible for him to do that, even though his mask was falling off. Clark Kent and Superman, Bruce Wayne and Batman. And so there's this definition, all of these things that are supposed to go into being a superhero. On the other hand, Mr. Clock says that they should not have clear definitions. And that comic book academics, people who are in colleges writing about comic books, should keep it that way. All right, that they should not attempt to have a definition, that there should not be a super dictionary. And the two kind of argue back and forth. Clock begins with his idea: if you say superheroes have to have superpowers, Batman's gone. If they have a secret identity, the Fantastic Four are gone because we know it's Reed Richards, we know it's Sue Storm Richards, we know it's Ben Grimm the Thing, we know it's Johnny Storm the Human Torch. We know all of that. If magic makes a story part of the genre of fantasy, then Wonder Woman, who has some magical abilities, especially in the new series Justice League Dark, Thor, who deals with magical creations and the mystical nature of the gods. And if aliens are for science fiction, Superman is out. So Clock says if you put together a definition, you're going to start excluding. Coogan, on the other hand, comes back and says, and he picks the Hulk and he picks Batman. He picks Wildcat, who was a DC character uh, in the in the past. Adam, and he's picking, I think, the 1950s, 1960s version of Adam, not the one who can shrink down to microscopic size. He talks about the Fantastic Four, and then he says they can lack a primary convention. In other words, superpowers, pro social mission, those sorts of things. But the stories can have the other conventions: the costume supervillains, the science fiction, the technology, the teams, the headquarters, and all the other accoutrements of superherodom. I think it's important to understand that perhaps, once again, we are being too academic. I've talked about being too academic in this class and in my freshman comp class. Perhaps we're arguing too much about academics, but I think it's important to understand that this is part of college life in some colleges where people are getting majors in popular culture and working for a master's in popular culture. Also, I think even Coogan wants to exclude certain people. And he has this distinction of superhero versus superhero. All right. And he uses the example later on in this paragraph of the difference between one word every day and every day with two words. The one word every day basically means ordinary. The every day with two words means each and every single day. And so, once again, he talks about the one with mission, the one with powers, the one with identity, and he's distinct from characters like Buffy the Vampire Slayer, the Shadow, who's one of the pulp heroes, Beowulf, who's one of the epic heroes, and Luke Skywalker. And the preponderance or totality of the conventions root these characters in other genres. Buffy is in horror. Uh, the Shadow comes from the pulp magazines, as I talked about before. Beowulf is one of the epic heroes in science fiction. And so even he is trying to exclude people who I think in a lot of ways meet that definition. I think especially Buffy the Vampire Slayer and quite frankly the Shadow uh, has a mission to find out what evil lurks in the hearts of men, and he has a secret identity and a lot of these other things. And so even Coogan I think is being somewhat disingenuous here as we're going through uh, the argument because he's trying to have it both ways in my mind. But nonetheless, I just wanted to point out that there's an argument about what the definition is or whether we should have a definition. I think mission, powers, and identity is pretty good. I think it includes Buffy and the Shadow, though. Another person, Rosenberg, talks about the idea that for a superhero, there has to be transformation, and that superheroes are always, in a sense, made. And transformation has been the key in a lot of the books we have read. Ada transformed, for example. Um, I think Q transformed in Paper Towns. I think there was transformation in A Long Way Gone. I think the growth that we saw in Katniss, the growth that we saw in Todd, all of those characters, I think, have in a sense been made, and superheroes seem to fall into that. Rosenberg goes on and says that there are three things that cause this transformation. She talks about trauma, where Batman and Iron Man became who they were because of trauma. The Daredevil saw his father beaten and killed with the trauma, plus he became a superhero through accident, which we'll get to in a second when the acid and stuff splashed in his face. The Punisher lost his family to the mob. Destiny. Wonder Woman was born to be this way. Buffy was born a slayer. Okay. Supergirl and Superman were born on Krypton to basically come to Earth and save it. And then there's chance. The Hulk was too close to the radioactive explosion. The X-Men have the X gene. The Fantastic Four got hit by gamma rays. As I said, Daredevil could fit in here as well. And the point I think that Rosenberg would make is that none of these are totally mutually exclusive. There can be trauma and chance. There can be chance and destiny. All of those things can tie together. Rosenberg then goes on to say that it's the transformation that makes us care about the superheroes. They show us the way forward, they inspire us, and we resonate with them because they inspire us. And then she kind of gives this individual response. Remember earlier in the presentation, we talked about that social response, figuring out our social condition from a distance. Here at the individual level, she talks about people who have to make sense of senseless loss, or they have to understand how we behaved and inferring what that says about us. Been in places that are bored silly and you can't wait to leave. That's she put Wonder Woman in that category. Burdens and responsibilities have been tossed at us, and we have to deal with them. And we have to figure out when we're stranded and alone how to take care of ourselves. Superheroes do all of that. Rosenberg says that that's why they resonate, and that's why we should care. Go beyond the academic of what isn't or isn't a superhero and move it to this individual thing. We should care because. Tomorrow, or excuse me, Monday, I'll pick up the Black Panther and we'll talk about the Black Panther specifically. But I thought that the background information was important, especially to kind of look at uh, black characters who come before the Black Panther and to take a look at um, why it fits into a college classroom and point out that academics all over the country are publishing about superheroes. Um, Hope you all have a good weekend, and we will see you Monday.